Thank you for joining first thing on Thursday morning, the last day of DevDays. I'm Josh Mandel. I'm going to give you an introduction to a project that has been near and dear to me called Sync for Science. And it's going to be a little bit different from some of the talks that you'll hear at DevDays, because this is really about a use case. It's about helping a community understand the potential of this technology, helping the community of researchers to understand how Smart and Fire and Oauth and this set of technologies that we've been working on as a community, how all of this can help them do more research in the biomedical space. So I'm going to dig in. There's a link to the slides at bit.ly/smart-devdays-boston with hyphens in between. I'll keep that link on for the next couple of slides. I would love for this to be interactive, so please raise your hand or shout out at me at any point, especially if I say something that doesn't make sense or is confusing, but also just if you've got a question. Really happy to tailor this to your interests, and please don't hesitate to do that. So in terms of funding, I should say that the work that I've done on Sync for Science has been funded by the National Institute of Health. There's been a project sponsored at Harvard Medical School with a small engineering team that's been working on a set of tools and reference architecture to help researchers get quickly up to speed with this. And I should say that I've separately been funded by Verily and most recently by Microsoft in my day-to-day employment. So let's just dig into the agenda. What I want to do is introduce you to the set of technologies that you will have heard about already if you've been through the Smart on Fire tracks and gotten a sense of how apps can integrate with EHRs here at DevDays. So I won't focus too much on the technology piece, but I'll try to draw connections to those details that you will have heard elsewhere. And then I want to talk about a pilot effort that we're doing with a particular research study called the All of Us Research Program, and then zoom out and talk about some of the broader scale adoption dynamics. So, today as a patient, if you want to share your electronic health record data with a research study, it's not that easy to get started, but we think that's changing, and we'll talk about the landscape and why that's changing and how fast. So we'll start by talking about this project called Sync for Science, and this is the value proposition sort of for the community, or for patients who might want to become research participants. And that is to say, with a click of a button, you can volunteer to share your health data to help scientists do groundbreaking research. And that's really the goal, is make it easy for patients who want to contribute their data to research to do that in a controlled and automated way. And when we talk about your healthcare data, we'll talk about a few different categories of data. Our early focus has been clinical data, but we're beginning to do work with financial data as well as imaging data to create a richer picture for researchers who want to look across various parts of a health record. And the goal here is really for data that patients have access to already in a patient portal. So if you can see it in your patient portal, we want to make it as easy as possible for you to donate it to researchers. But we're not talking about sort of secret back channel flow between different systems that the patient can't see what's happening. The goal is really transparency, and we'll talk through that in some more detail as well. The overall idea is that sharing is initiated by patients, and they start with a patient-facing app that is provided by a particular research study. So if you're a researcher and you're doing a study that could benefit from electronic health record data, you may be interacting with your research participants already. You might have built an app that runs on iOS using ResearchKit. You might have written an app from scratch that recruits people and gives them surveys on an ongoing basis. There's lots of ways you might want to interact with your research participants. And this becomes one more capability you can add to that kind of app. So I want to talk a little bit through the structure of this project because it's cross-cutting and interesting in some ways. And the structure also gives you some insight into why we focused on the pieces of this puzzle that we have. So first of all, we began this project working very closely with a set of electronic health record vendors in 2016. So this is working with Cerner and Epic and eClinicalWorks and Allscripts, and sitting down with their technical teams and saying, you know what, there's a spectrum of implementation support that these vendors had for the Smart on Fire specifications at the time. And we wanted to get to the point where we could say, here is a set of API calls that any research app should be able to make. And we sat down with the technical teams and with the product management teams at those vendors and said, OK, let's just agree on a list of API calls. And I'll show you what that looks like. And each vendor figured out an implementation plan to be able to get there. Some were very close already. Some were starting from scratch. But over the course of about 6 months, those vendors were able to stand up working test implementations that they've since driven into production. We worked very closely with the NIH on this project, which is to say not only did they sponsor the project with funding, but they've been helping us think about where and how to pilot this in the real world, and as well as with the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. So the ONC initially helped rally support from a set of vendors, and has been really vocal and public about the value of this kind of technology to open up doors for patients to be able to share data where and when they want. But one of the key ingredients in our success here has really been Hipaa, and as many people will see, Hipaa is often used as an excuse or stands in the way of sharing data across organizations, but it also provides some very fundamental rights for patients. And there's a very strong right of individual access under Hipaa, which is what we leverage, so that when patients say they want to share their data with a research study, it's not just telling a healthcare provider, oh, it would be nice if you sent my data over there, or I allow you to send my data over there. It's actually an instruction. It's saying I'm invoking my right to access my data and share it with a third party, and there's some regulatory teeth behind that request. And so there's an interesting kind of legal framework for this kind of sharing, but it's very straightforward from the perspective of enabling patients to access their own data. And at the same time, there's a regulatory undercurrent, which is the meaningful use and the EHR certification program. So under meaningful use stage 3, there's a requirement that providers need to start turning on patient-accessible APIs. Right? Under stage 1 and 2, there was a requirement for portals, and the requirement that patients be able to download data from their portals in some kind of a file that they could save locally. And in meaningful use stage 3, there's a requirement that builds on that, saying patients need to have access to their data through APIs. And the way that this was spelled out in the regulations was what's called a functional requirement. So effectively, the Office of the National Coordinator said, these are the kinds of data, these are the categories of data you need to be able to share. But they didn't say, here's the technologies that you need to use. They didn't say, here's the specific versions of FHIR that you need to support. They didn't even say you need to support FHIR at all. They just said, you need a way to support sharing a med list, sharing a problem list, sharing allergies, those kinds of requirements. But those two things together provide a strong interest, first of all, from the vendor community to be able to meet that regulatory requirement for certification. And then the providers have an interest in turning it on because that makes them eligible for these meaningful use incentives. And we'll talk about the timeline, and we'll talk about how widespread this is going to be. So at the same time that this regulatory landscape is coming together, of course, there's an open standards landscape coming together. And we've been working very closely with the FHIR community and building a set of profiles through the Smart on FHIR OAuth or authorization guide that we can use so we can have a very clear mapping to say, here's a set of functional requirements. Providers need to be able to share these kinds of data. Well, here's the technology to do it using open standards. So we work very closely with the Argonaut organization and the broader community to make sure that those standards lined up very closely with the regulatory requirements. And then one of the things that my team at Harvard has done over the course of this project has been to try to make it as easy as possible to look at a vendor implementation of the Smart on FHIR API and test it top to bottom. See if it's working properly, see if the data look right, see if values are coded correctly, check out those Argonaut profiles and see if the data matches. So we built a comprehensive test suite that I'll talk through in more detail and show you a demo of. But that's effectively the scope of who's been involved and the work that we've been doing in the Sync for Science project. And so now I want to back off a little bit and talk about some of the challenges that researchers have when they're thinking about how to get access to electronic health record data. And I'm going to describe two paradigms for working with health record data or for getting access to health records. One is kind of a hospital-centered model, and this has been conventionally a very strong approach for research studies that want to recruit a broad population, especially if they want to do it in a particular region or in specific locations. But the idea here is that as a researcher, you might be based in a particular hospital or healthcare institution, or you might have ties to one institution that is affiliated with others, maybe over some geographic space. And what you can do is you can say, I'm going to get those hospitals or those health systems together to support my research study. I'm going to have them help me do recruitment. And since those individual hospitals and health systems are actually committed to supporting my research, they know me, they know what I'm investigating, they trust me, I've got sort of an in those places, and I can ask them for help extracting data from the EHR. I can go to the IT team at each of those hospitals, and I can say, here's a list of the patients who have enrolled in my study. Can you please do a data extract? And then they might extract the data and hand it over to me once a quarter, once a year, so that I can run my study. And this kind of model has some really strong advantages to it. One advantage is that you can recruit research participants at the point of care. So you can meet them in their clinician's office and explain to them the opportunity to participate in this new study, and there's kind of a trusted environment there to have that conversation. And the other advantage is you can ask for really well-defined data structures from those healthcare providers because there's an IT team. There's a set of business analysts and database experts who can extract data from those systems just for you. Pull out the specific fields that you want, format it the way that you requested it. The downside is this can be very expensive, having to support the IT staff to do that kind of data extraction one study at a time. And it can also be slow or expensive to create those networks of hospitals. You need to sign legal agreements. You need to make sure that each of those hospitals can extract data in a consistent way. And then especially if you're studying a rare condition, it might be hard to get the right network of hospitals to represent the patients that have the condition you're interested in. If you think about a condition where there may be only dozens or hundreds of people around the whole country with this disease, your network might not have very good coverage for that population. So there's some real trade-offs to this kind of hospital-centered recruitment, but it's a very common approach. I want to contrast this a little bit with what I would call person-centered recruitment, which is to say you could reach out to individuals in the community where they live and work. Maybe you reach out to communities that are in sort of disease-specific areas or forums. You could just advertise on the subway. There's lots of ways to meet people where they are in their community. And when you recruit people that way, one of the strong advantages is that you can have a dialogue with them. They joined your study because you reached out to them and they accepted your offer in some sense. And you can start to give them surveys over time, collect patient-reported outcomes directly from them, so you can get a very rich set of data from interacting directly with those participants. On the other hand, it can be really challenging to get health records for those individuals because their data are necessarily spread out across a very wide number of provider organizations, all in different places and formats. Getting access to those data today often means setting up a fax machine, faxing out requests for records to be sent, and then receiving a pile of faxes over time. And then you have to figure out what to do with that stack of paper to make sense of it. So you've got this diversity of data formats, but it's also really inconvenient to work with. And if you think about this from the participant perspective, you've just joined a new research study. You're eager to share your data, but if you want to do it, what are the next steps? Well, maybe you have to sign a bunch of paperwork. Maybe you have to send some faxes. Maybe you have to drive across town to your clinic and literally pick something up. It's a tremendous ask. That said, there are many dedicated and devoted research participants who are willing to take these steps. And so the person-centered model still today is a very strong way to recruit, especially in a rare disease community. But I just want to give you a sense of some of these trade-offs, because what I'm going to describe is a technology that is far from perfect, but it hits an interesting spot on this trade-off curve. So I want to give you a sense of what this looks like. So from the Sync for Science perspective, what we're saying is that over time, many providers are turning on these patient portals. The patient portal vendors are enabling APIs. And then as a research participant, here's the workflow that we're trying to enable. I first join a study, and I'll use the All of Us research study as an example of a study that I could join. But the goal is this should work with any research study. So I join the All of Us study, for example. I download their mobile app, or I interact with their web-based application. And there may be many ways in which I participate. I may be providing blood and specimens. I may be answering surveys. I may be turning on some mobile tracking features to be able to share a continuous stream of data with the program. And at some point, they say, do you want to share your health records? And if I do, then I begin this electronic workflow where the research app sends me over to my patient portal. So I will identify something about where I've received care, and they'll send me over to my portal. The portal will display an approval screen or a series of approval screens asking, hey, it looks like you're trying to share data with the All of Us research program. Here's what you'll be sharing. Is that what you want to do? And if I approve it, I'll be sent back to the All of Us research app, and the research app will now have access to an ongoing feed of my health record data. And if I decline, I'll be sent back to the research app, and there will be a message saying, it looks like you chose not to share. So that's the kind of automated loop or workflow that we're aiming to support for consumers. Put individuals in charge of where they want to share their own data, and do it based in the patient portals that providers are turning on in order to meet these regulatory requirements of meaningful use. So let me pause there and see if there's questions in terms of the big picture of the workflow. All right, so let's dig in a little bit to some of the technology that we're building out to support this. One thing that I want to give you a quick sense of is the underlying data, and in particular the FHIR API calls that we're using. And so this is a quick list of the sort of data types that the regulations require. These are things like allergies, immunization, lab results, problem list, procedure list, smoking status. This is what's called a common clinical data set under meaningful use stage 3. And it's not every piece of data in a health record. There's a lot that's missing from this. And in particular, free text notes aren't on this list. Radiology and imaging results aren't on this list. Things like flow sheets from a hospital visit aren't on this list. There's a lot that you might want to have access to that you can't get. But at the same time, this is a pretty rich set of data for starting to build anything from visualization to calculating simple risk models to training up new machine learning algorithms. Ricky, please. patient documents, the question is, what does patient's documents mean on this list? The very narrow thing that it means on this list is the ability to download a CCDA summary document from the EHR portal. So I said that the regulations have what's called a functional requirement about all the different data types. The one thing that they do call out in terms of any specific data format is they say there also has to be a way to share a CCDA clinical summary document. And that really hasn't been a focus for our effort in Sync for Science. We haven't used those documents at all because we've been focused on driving support for granular FHIR resources. But I include this on the list because it is part of what's specified. And over time, my hope is that that will grow to encompass any kind of patient document, including full-text clinical notes, but not yet. Thank you for the question. Yeah, please. Yeah, so this is a question about workflow and in particular sharing data across boundaries of HIPAA-covered entities. And the main use case that we have in mind here when we think about this loop is the following. So in general, my research app up here is a consumer-facing health app. It's not, in general, a HIPAA-covered entity. It's something sort of outside of that space. But my patient portal is something my healthcare provider gives to me. This is part of a HIPAA-covered entity. And so the flow of data here is outside, from a covered entity to the outside world. And so the regulatory environment for this is to say that as a healthcare consumer, as a patient, I'm making the decision to take my data out of my provider and share it with this third-party app. So at that point, that third-party app is not typically a HIPAA-covered entity. Does that help? Okay, so the receiving side of this transaction is not another physician. It's a research app, just to clarify that point. And in terms of a patient's opportunity to change things, the connection that gets made is directly between the app and the healthcare provider. So when the app is fetching those data, when it says, hey, could I have a list of allergies for Josh, it's getting that list directly from the healthcare provider. The patient doesn't have an opportunity to change the data in the middle of that transaction. Okay, and the other note about this data set is that it's fully identified. And this is an interesting kind of decision from the perspective of Sync for Science. You could ask, well, wouldn't it be very important to help patients share a de-identified data set with researchers? It gives you a better sense of safety and trust. It limits the access that you'd need to share with researchers. And our early assessment was twofold. One is that de-identifying healthcare data is very difficult, and there's always a trade-off between the quality of the data that survives the de-identification process and the particular kinds of analysis that you want to do. Second point is that we did not want to invent anything new here specifically for research. We wanted to lean into the same open standards that support consumer access for any kind of app. So we think that research apps should just be like the same thing as any consumer health app. Use the same API, get access to the same data feeds. So that's a little bit about why these are fully identified data feeds. And then I mentioned that set of data in the common clinical data set. I wanted to show you in our website, in our specification. The website is syncfor.science, syncfor.science. And one of the main components of this documentation site is our list of API calls. So we try to be very specific here about how a well-behaved research app is going to talk to the EHR system. And in general, there's 3 buckets of data: clinical data, financial data, and imaging data. And here we'll focus on the clinical data because this is the piece that's been implemented in production by real EHR vendors and is available today pretty broadly in portals. We'll talk a little bit about financial data, which has been implemented by the CMS team as part of their Blue Button 2.0 effort. And so this is also a real service that you can connect to in production today. Our imaging data access is what I would call prototype. We've done a proof of concept with some sample data to show how this would work, but nobody is sharing these imaging data for a Sync for Science app in production today. On the clinical data side, what we do is describe how to use the Smart on FHIR specifications in a little bit of detail, and I won't go through all of it here. I just want to highlight a couple of aspects of the expectations that we set up. So first of all, the idea with Sync for Science, Sync stands for synchronize, and the idea is that we want to have historical access to as much of the electronic health record as is available, and then we want to have ongoing access, so over time, as a patient receives more health care, researchers get access to that data over time, and the data set grows. So what we spell out is a well-behaved research app. The first time it connects to a given provider is going to do a historical data fetch. So we have a set of expectations about what happens on that first connection. And then we expect that there will be periodic fetches over time. So like once a week, for example, the app might check in and say, hey, is there anything new? And in that case, we have a slightly narrower request where the app will be able to ask just for what's new since the last week. And so we go through each of the API calls and describe how to make those two kinds of requests. And again, I won't go through all of them here, but I want to give you, one example, which would be, let's just say, getting a patient's problem list. So we try to tie this specification back to the meaningful use requirements as closely as we can. So we've got a section here on the problem list, and we link to the common clinical data set definition. So if you want to see how this is motivated in the underlying regulations, this will take you to the 2015 EHR certification rules that sort of set up these expectations. And then we tie it back to the Smart on Fire and Argonaut implementation guides, so you can see what the data are supposed to look like. So we've got a link to the page in the Argonaut specification that talks about how we use the Fire condition resource to give access to the problem list. And then we link to the Fire spec as well. Everything we're doing up to this point is, for clinical data, is using Fire DSTU2. This is what vendors have in production. This is the version of the spec that was current when we started. And we expect this is going to stay current for a while in terms of production implementations. I get this question quite often, when are you going to move to STU3? When are you going to move to R4? And the easy answer is, right now as a community, this is where we are, and we want to meet that community in place. The other thing that we do on this page is provide a simple way to just make a sample request against our demo server. So you can hit this button here that says make a request, and you'll get back a Fire bundle with, in this case, 10 problems on the patient's problem list. Question, please. So how far back can you go in time? The answer is, as far as our research use case is considered, we want to go back as far as we can. And so the request that we make here is a Fire request that says, I want access to all the conditions for this patient. Now, in practice, some EHR systems have limitations, or some health systems only have electronic data going back a certain duration of time. Maybe they only go back to the time at which they first implemented their EHR. But others have imported legacy data that go back even longer. And from the perspective of the size and scope of data, this is an area where Fire provides a little bit of support for pagination. So you'll never get a single payload that's unboundedly large. The server will give you pages of data, and you can fetch one page at a time. But you're right that it might be quite a big data set. And we look at that more as an opportunity than a technical challenge. Please, yeah. Are we restricting the data to what's covered by Argonaut? I think the simple way to say it is we describe a set of API calls that we want to make sure vendors can support if they want to say we can support Sync for Science. And that's the set of Argonaut data calls. But vendors may have additional API calls that they support, and we might very well tell researchers, hey, here's some extra things that you can try. But we wanted to create kind of a common base of behavior that any compliant portal should be able to support, and so Argonaut was the natural choice for that piece. Yeah, please. So in terms of version updates, for clinical data, my expectation is that, yeah, we'll wait for the Argonaut group to publish an updated guide before we update how we connect. But for some of the other data areas we're exploring, including imaging and including financial data, those aren't tied to Argonaut. Those aren't use cases that Argonaut has taken up yet. And so we've worked in some cases with the Blue Button organization at CMS, and in other cases with the Radiological Society of North America on imaging, to just figure out what are best practices for sharing those data, and we've built out a reference implementation using those other data types. Yeah, please. Why don't we just do $1 everything? The simple answer, AL, is that $1 everything is not part of the Argonaut spec, and the vendor portals don't support it. So this was really a question of trying to find that path right down the middle of the road of what's reasonably supported in production today. Semantically, $1 everything does a great job of capturing what you might want, but there are some interesting questions about how you paginate the data you get out and about how you capture change sets over time as the set of everything changes. But for folks who haven't seen, Fire defines an operation called $everything, and maybe even to just able to Google search for it. But in Fire, the $everything operation says, for a given patient, I want to export all of the data about that patient. Give me a bundle with all the different resource types that pertain to the record that I need for this individual patient. The way you request it is basically doing a get on patient/ID/$everything. So that semantically does capture the idea that we want. Other questions or comments? Yeah, please.
So the pulling data for the purposes of research, do you think in the future it'll move to sort of more precise, so if something changes in the patient record,
Over time, we'll be able to move from a polling model where the app pulls data from an EHR to a push model where changes are automatically distributed out. Is that the question?
Yeah, basically.
I hope so. There's not a lot of technical work happening right now in the portal vendor community to support that, but there's a lot of good technical work happening right now in the broader FHIR community around subscriptions and around event notification. And I think that as those specifications become more mature, it'll be a natural follow-on step. There are obviously trade-offs. So if you think about something like a mobile phone-based application that is going to be receiving data directly from these provider sites, the phone needs to be on, it needs to be routable on the internet. So there are some scenarios where pull makes sense. There are other scenarios where push makes sense. Yeah, please.
So I'm assuming if the Argonaut increases, you're going to increase the capability. My question is, patients saying, yes, share my data with this research community, what assurance does the patient have that research community is really research
Yeah.
and has gone to IRB or
Yep. So this is a really important question. And this is something that I struggle with when I'm communicating fundamentally what Sync for Science is. And so after the talk, I'd love any reflections or advice about how to do this piece better. So when you talk about sharing data with the research community, that's not what Sync for Science is about. Sync for Science is about helping individual researchers that are running their own studies to request data from a patient. So at any given point, I'll do an example. A patient is making a decision to share their data with a particular research study. And that research study had better be taking that patient through an informed consent process, had better be explaining the risks and benefits of participating in that study in order to enable that patient to make an informed decision. And that's really important, and it's going to vary tremendously from study to study. Some studies might be looking at a chemotherapy interventional trial with very high risk. Oh, and by the way, could you please share your EHR data so we've got access to your history? Other studies might be just saying, can we take a look at the history of your lab values because we're going to try to build a machine learning model across the population to predict diabetes a year in advance, right? Those are very different kinds of risks and benefits. And so we never talk about sharing data with the research community writ large. We talk about sharing data with a particular study. Yeah, please. Yeah, so the question is let me use this opportunity to present one more slide and then answer the question. So the question is, you're using Oauth 2, how does sort of app registration and configuration work? So there's the two main sets of standards that we're using here. For authorization, we're using Oauth 2, which is a web-based standard for letting users share access that they've got to data with an app where they want the data to flow into. And in general, for this kind of Oauth 2-based sharing to work, the app that a user wants to enable is what's called an Oauth Client. That client needs to be registered with the data providers ahead of time. It gets what's called a client ID and often something called a client secret that it can use to make those requests in an authenticated way. And so the answer is, yeah, if you want to be able to connect to 10 or 100 or 1,000 provider sites around the country, your app needs to be registered with those 10 or 100 or 1,000 sites in order to work. And we'll get into discussion about scalability in a little bit. But the short answer is, yes, you need to be registered. We've been focused on the point-to-point thing. One app connecting to one provider at a time has to be registered in order for that to work. But this infrastructure, if you have good support for point-to-point connections, you can start to build data aggregators. You can start to build connectors that allow you to feed data in and then put patients in charge of sharing data downstream. And you could think of Apple's Health app as doing something similar to that, which enables a consumer to make these point-to-point connections to individual providers, but then share data out of the Health app downstream. So there are a lot of architectural possibilities if you've got these building blocks in place. Yeah, please.
We've done a lot around consenting and for IRBs and stuff like that. But one of those research boards wants to ensure is the authorization of the user, so user identity management. How are these apps kind of validating or verifying that the user is really who they are when they consent
Yep.
to participating for the share?
So this is a great question. I want to unpack this consent question into two parts. Let me try to do it in the context of a demo to get at this issue of consent. So in general, there's two kinds of things that people sometimes call consent. And I think you're using the word in a very precise way, but let me try to describe these two things side by side so we've got a sense of where they fit together. And it'll be super awesome if the demo works. It worked 30 minutes ago, which was great. But if it doesn't, I'll just tell the story directly. So the quick story that I want to tell is there's two conversations that a patient has. One is what I would call an informed consent conversation. And that typically happens before any EHR sharing is initiated. So that is to say the patient or the research participant has a relationship with the research study. They have this dialogue called informed consent. And the research participant says, yes, I want to participate in the study. All right, and that's up to the research study to figure out how they want to manage identity. You know, maybe they make the participant come in person. Maybe it's an app that's distributed over the web and advertised broadly. There's many options. But that's one sort of connection that happens between the research participant and the research study. Then there's a second conversation that happens between that same individual, the research participant, but now they're wearing their patient hat. And so there's a conversation that happens between the patient and the healthcare provider organization. And that, sometimes people call that consent to share, but it's really a Hipaa request for individual access, where the individual is telling their provider organization, yes, please send my data to this app. And the identity management for that piece is handled entirely by the HIPAA-covered entity, by the healthcare provider. And typically that's done using their standard practices for portal access. So anybody who can give their patients a patient portal today has some process for handing out patient portal accounts, helping to provision them, resetting your password if you lose it, all those kinds of details. Provider organizations individually sort of figure out how to make that work, usually with help from their vendors. There's not consistency across the board, so every provider has different practices for helping you set up a portal account, but everybody's got something that works and that meets their internal HIPAA security review, or HIPAA review, in order to meet that bar for identity management. And as far as this protocol is concerned, that person has two identities, two hats they wear, the research participant and the patient. And the fact that the patient is able to share the record successfully using this technology means they have access to it, means they have the right to share it. That's about how we break things down. Does that get at the answer to your question?
Yeah, kind of. So when I was asking, I was looking at that first scenario around informed consent.
Yes.
So let's say this research app was publicly available and you're looking to, broaden the population of, the research pool. How does one sign into that third-party app and guarantee without a face-to-face encounter, for example, that you are Josh Mandel?
Yep. Good. So the short answer is that's not a general requirement. Strong identity proofing back to like a real-world known identity may or may not be a requirement for your research study. That's sort of an IRB determination. And this really comes down to what your IRB expects of you as a researcher. I think it's not our demo, it's just my internet access that's sketching out here. But what I wanted to show you was an example of a real-world study, the All of Us research program. But if you go to joinallofus.org, anyone in the world can sign up, and all you need is an email address, and you create a password. And then you use that web-based portal to go through an informed consent process where, in the case of this study, you provide your name, you provide your address, you provide your phone number. You can leave stuff out if you want, and then program onboards you on that basis. So these are the kinds of decisions that each study makes on its own in a way that's particular to that study. Timing-wise, do we have 6 minutes? Is that right? Does anybody know? All right, we've got 6 minutes left. One thing I want to do is jump ahead to talk about the adoption dynamics a little bit. I'm going to skip over a pilot that we're doing, but we're doing a pilot with about a dozen sites around the country as part of the All of Us research program, which is why I bring up the All of Us program as an example. It's one where I've seen a lot of the internal details. What I want to just show briefly is this very vague adoption curve with rough dates on it, which is to say, 2 years ago, there were 0 portals that supported these APIs. Now there's a bunch. Epic has a list on open.epic.com. Last time I looked, it was approaching 150, or just over 150 individual healthcare provider organizations that support these APIs. So we went from 0 to 150 in that time span. We've got production sites from Cerner, from Allscripts, from eClinicalWorks. I know that the Apple Health app is connecting to Athena Health using these same open APIs. So there's adoption happening. Originally, that adoption was spurred on by, among other things, regulatory requirements. And we thought that providers needed to be offering these APIs by the beginning of this year. Through a series of delays at this point, those requirements really won't come online until the end of next year. And so there's a delay in terms of how hard and how fast the regulations are pushing. And I expect that's going to sort of shift this adoption curve over to the right. And it's still a bit of guesswork to figure out how many providers, what fraction of patients will be able to access their data using these APIs this year, next year, or the year after. But my strong prediction is that it's going to keep going up, and we'll get to the point that most people can share most of their data using these kinds of APIs within a few years. AL. Thank you. So everything that I've talked about here is I'm giving you a talk through the S4S lens, but we could just say this about the Smart on Fire API support with Argonaut profiles more broadly. And I've got one more slide that I wanted to show in that perspective, which is, we've been talking here about Sync for Science. There's nothing special or proprietary about these APIs. We think there will be many, many apps out there in the world using these same APIs, some of which will be research apps, and some of which will be consumer health apps, using the same technologies, using the same APIs. These guys, of course, have to do informed consent. These guys, have privacy policies and other ways of communicating expectations to end users, but it's not a research context in particular. So, all right, we've got a few more minutes if there's additional questions. Yeah, please, Elliot.
So this is all based on Argonaut, which means it's all based, it's US-centric.
So the clinical data profiles are based on Argonaut, which is US-centric. There's nothing intrinsic to the way that we expect the data to look, other than the fact that in our testing and evaluation of vendor support, we check for these Argonaut profiles, which often will have vocabularies. Oh, I forgot that I was offline, and that caused me to be online, which is great. So like one of the things, for example, that we'll do is when we run our test suite against each new vendor implementation, we will look at the vocabularies that are used to communicate a medication list. And we expect that to be RX norm, and we'll throw a warning if it's not. That's something that would be different in Canada, and different in Europe, and different in Australia. But there's a pretty clear hook point in the specification and the validation logic where you could start building out regional specific profiles that made sense in other regions. Yeah, please.
I have a little bit of a fringe question. I mean, a lot of this is contingent upon patient-mediated access, so they have to give consent. So when the patient dies and you need access to that patient's longitudinal record, is there a way to leverage Sync for Science infrastructure that you build if the patient can no longer give its own consent?
Yeah, so in the general space of patient-mediated consent, what happens when patients aren't around anymore because they died? Maybe they're no longer competent to share data. There's lots of reasons, or lots of interesting edge cases here. The short answer is this isn't something we thought about too deeply, so I'm just speaking off the cuff. In general, the question of sort of digital death is an interesting one, and one that we need to address more as a society. And if you look at things that Google and Facebook do to sort of anticipate these events, I think we'll see more of this in the healthcare space. But the short answer, at least in the healthcare world today, is that individuals can still appoint delegated, what's the word I want? Representatives for their healthcare data to be able to make decisions about access and sharing. So at least that's one path today, where if you've decided to participate in a research study, there may be still someone out there who's authorized to keep sharing on your behalf for some time. We've got 2 minutes. Are there other questions or comments in this space? Yeah, please.
So I know a big part of all of us is eventually to do genetic data as well. But it's what are the plans for sort of incorporating sequencing data or mutation reports?
Yeah, so this is a question about the All of Us program in particular, which I didn't get much time to talk about the work we've been doing with the All of Us program, but it's a large NIH-funded study to recruit 1 million volunteers or more across the country and follow them and their health over 10 years or more. And it's really a multimodal kind of data collection process to create a large data set that researchers can come to. It'll have a deep survey component to it. It'll have a big electronic health record data component to it. It will have a set of blood draws where we collect biospecimens and do individual tests. And it will include genomic data of various kinds that are processed from those biospecimens. The short story is that the program hasn't yet begun collecting genomic data, so they're still in a process of developing the policies for data collection, generation, and access control. But big picture, these are data sets that are going to be made available alongside EHR data and alongside surveys. So as a researcher, you could come into the platform, and the prototypes that are being built today are, you get a web-based browsing tool, and you get a Jupyter notebook environment where you can write Python code or R code to query a set of databases that have those EHR data in an OMAP format, and eventually we'll have genomic data. Maybe you'll be able to query a variant store, for example, alongside. One last question, please.
Does the patient have the authority or ability to limit the amount of data or say what they can give, and can they put a window on there?
Great. So yeah, what degree of control do patients or research participants have over what gets shared? So I'm going to give you, hopefully not too subtle an answer here. From the work that we did with each of the EHR vendors, what we asked them was to make sure there was some way for a patient to share their whole data set. And then what we said was we strongly encouraged the vendors to enable more fine-grained sharing controls in a way that made sense within their products. Trying to standardize how the fine-grained control works is very hard. And so we built out a demo, a reference platform, where we did finer-grained sharing based on FHIR resource types and based on those categories in the meaningful use common clinical data set. So I could say, yes, my vital signs, but no, not my labs, that sort of thing. And we put that out as an example for the EHR vendors. Some of the vendors took that example very literally and said, great, we're going to build exactly those controls into our approval process. Some of the vendors said, you know what, we want a streamlined process to start, and there's going to be one button, all or nothing, share or don't. So there's a variety of different approaches being taken to this today, and I think that's a good thing, because getting this right and standardizing it is really hard. All right, I'll be around for the rest of the day, happy to talk through additional questions and comments afterwards. Thank you guys for the questions.